Hello viewers. One religion that absolutely fascinates me because of the way it seems to dominate the discourse these days, and especially news events, is definitely Islam. And I'm anxious to speak to former Muslims who have since realized that they were involved in something not as pleasant as they intended to begin with. And I have with me a fantastic advocate for ex-Muslims. Yasmine Mohammed is author and activist. She has written a book called From Al-Qaeda to Atheism. She is also a co-host of the Secular Jihadists podcast. Yasmine, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Lloyd. I'm excited about this conversation.
Absolutely, because it's not every day you get an ex-Muslim speaking to an ex-Jehovah's Witness, but we'll see what happens. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about your background and what led you to get involved in the Muslim faith.
Well, I didn't have a choice with getting involved in the Muslim faith. I was born into it. So my mom came from a pretty secular background growing up in Egypt, but it wasn't until she came to Canada and her and my father's relationship fell apart. And so she was looking for comfort, looking for security, and she went to the mosque. And that's where she found her new community. And it's unfortunately, it's a story that is, I've heard other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses tell me that their moms were also single moms, and that was also part of the reason why they joined it, or Scientologists, like all these very tight-knit cult-type religions are great for women that are on their own, because now all of a sudden they have this really tight support system. But the problem is the price that you pay for that really tight support system. So our lives completely changed from that moment on. So my mom ended up marrying a man that was already married and already had 3 children, but he took her on as his second concurrent wife, because Muslims can marry up to 4. A Muslim man can have up to 4 wives. And
that must have been very strange for you as a kid.
It was very strange for me. They actually kept it from us as children because polygamy is against the law in Canada. So they didn't want us to know that's what was happening. He was just like a family friend, a very close family friend.
Well, that's one way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah. And he came in and just completely changed our world. He demanded that my mom start covering her hair. He demanded that we all start memorizing the Quran and start praying. Suddenly we weren't allowed to do anything that was, an invention, something that the Prophet Muhammad didn't do. We weren't allowed to do it. So birthdays were out of the, canceled. All of a sudden, music, we weren't allowed to. He came and actually broke all of our records, because that's how old I am. We actually had a record player with records. And suddenly it was, you can't have non-Muslim friends. You can't ride a bike anymore. You can't swim anymore. You can't wear these clothes anymore. We started going to Islamic schools. A hijab was put on me. It was just all downhill from there. So I was never really happy at all about this thing that took over my life, but I was very scared. I mean, the stories of how you're going to burn in hell are very, very detailed. And as a kid, when you get told these things, it's not like theoretical, or it's not like it's a story. This is literal. So the nightmares and the trauma that those kinds of, the fear, the constant fear, is what was the most drastic difference, I think, between being a Muslim and non-Muslim. Just not being scared all the time. It was very liberating. I'm sure you can relate to that. Like every single step you make, anything you do, you're always like just terrified that you're going to make the wrong decision, that you're going to end up burning in hell for eternity. So that was my life. Eventually I was forced into a marriage with a man, and it turned out that he was a member of Al-Qaeda. He was chosen for me because he's such a good Muslim man. He's so good that he's willing to die for the name of Allah. So He is now in prison in Egypt because he's a jihadi. And I had a daughter with him before I got away from him. And so her and I basically escaped from him, escaped from my mom, and started going to university. And eventually we had to change our names and move and start our lives all over again. And here we are.
It's an astonishing story, and there's so much to unpack there. I could kind of zero in on any of those little details that you've given. I think I'm just going to go right back to the beginning where you talked about the way cults tend to prey on single mothers. In my own family's case, it wasn't quite like that, but I can definitely relate to people in a vulnerable situation being more prone, being more susceptible to cults, basically, because on my father's side, my father's mother was contacted just after both her parents had died. And on my mother's side, she had a very tumultuous life. Her first marriage ended in divorce, and her second marriage, her husband died in a fire. So huge, tumultuous, traumatizing events. You're basically a prime target for a group to come along and say, we have all the answers. You don't need to worry about any of these things because we know what's happening.
Yeah, and I actually heard, correct me if I'm wrong, that Jehovah's Witnesses like to prey on people, especially that are going through grief. That's when they come and find them, because they know that's when people are the most vulnerable and the most willing to just do anything to get this pain to go away.
They probably wouldn't put it like that, but the truth is, yes. There's a brochure, or there's actually leaflets as well that are targeted towards people who are going through that situation. And yes, there have been stories of even witnesses going through the obituaries to try and find people that they can write letters to. So it definitely happens.
And sort of expanding on that, that's what happened with my ex, the jihadi. He was also preyed on, not because he was going through grief, but because he didn't fit in with his peer group at school. So they also were looking for sort of the stray pack, the animal that sort of wasn't part of the pack, and then they prey on that person, and that's how they got him as a teenager to join them and to lie to his family and go to Afghanistan.
And what that also means is that you end up with groups that are absolutely brimming with some very antisocial people who wouldn't get by in life probably very easily if it wasn't for the fact that you have conditional friendships, and
absolutely
everyone has to be your friend in this movement. So astonishing. Okay, during your time as a believer, were you? I have to ask this question: were you ever at a stage where you could imagine killing for your faith, or you could endorse others doing it?
Oh, that was a given. We were constantly told that that Muslims are the only people that we should ever value. Like they're the only lives that matter, really. So talking about killing non-Muslims in order to establish the caliphate and in order for Islam to expand over the planet, that's elementary. Like that's basics. I used to get sat down, and my mom, if she saw that I was becoming friends with any non-Muslims, she'd get very upset, and she would drill into my mom was a student of Al-Azhar University. I should mention, she's I'm not sure if you're familiar with Al-Azhar, but it's a very famous Islamic university in Egypt. And so she would sit us down and make sure that we promised to chop off the heads of, and then she would say the name of the person who she felt was getting too close to us. And a friend of mine who is an ex-Mormon, actually, she was an ex-Mormon, ex-Muslim, and now she's an atheist. Her husband's family used to sit her down and make her promise that she'd be willing to kill her own family And she said, yes, she would. And I totally get that. It's like this weird, it's brainwashing, you know, it's not like we ever thought about it, but it's like you're like a cyborg. It's not, you're not given the opportunity to actually think about what you're saying. You just have to say what needs to be said. I don't know how to explain it. It's like being in the military or something where you just do, you don't ask questions. You're not allowed to ask questions. Asking questions is punished, right? It's deadly. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble for even just questioning something.
I think
so. When
yeah.
you're indoctrinated in that from a young age, you just stop asking questions. You stop thinking questions. You just accept. And so it's really disgusting to think back at the kinds of things that I used to believe and the kinds of things that I used to be okay with. But it's been 15 years, so I've had a lot of therapy. So I've had a lot of time to process this, and I'm at the point where I just feel like I want to hug the little girl that I used to be. I'm not angry at myself anymore. I'm not disgusted at myself anymore. Now I'm just sad that those years, you know, were wasted with my true self being dampened because I was too scared to speak out.
Although going through that experience, if I can just play devil's advocate, going through that experience has put you in a position where you can help others. And I'm sure there'll be people watching this video who are drawing a great deal of strength, not just non-Muslims, but former Muslims, but people from different backgrounds who are able to draw strength from your experience because you've been through that experience.
And that's exactly what heals me, is helping other people that were in the situation, that are in the situation that I was in. It helps me sort of, it's almost like I'm helping that little girl.
Indeed. Well, with witnesses, I mean, just to kind of compare a little bit, witnesses have their kind of global jihad outsourced to heaven. So they believe in Armageddon being imminent, and at Armageddon, everyone who's not a witness is going to die. And that's a weird belief to kind of get to grips with. But again, like you say, you just kind of get on with it. You just think, well, that's what's going to happen, and I'd better look forward to it. And another similar thing is blood transfusions. You're aware that in principle, you should be willing to let your child die if you have a child refusing blood. You just accept that. You don't really think it through too much, I don't think. There's kind of a disconnect going on.
100%. Yeah, totally.
I'm just kind of, I know what's going to happen in the comment section because you're my second ex-Muslim that I've interviewed, and there will be people saying, oh yes, but this isn't all forms of Islam. There are different forms of Islam, and different forms of Islam teach different things. Just kind of for the record, how common would you say it is, recognizing the fact that there are different forms of Islam, how common do you think your background is in terms of the kind of fundamentalist teaching that you were subjected to?
So I was a Sunni Muslim, so about 90% of Muslims currently are Sunni. So that just gives you an idea of the scope. And I was a conservative Sunni Muslim. And if you look at Pew Research, you'll see again, conservative Sunni Muslims are in the vast, vast majority. So if you look at the research of the questions that were asked, things like, do you think that homosexuals are immoral? And, you know, you're getting responses in the 80 and 90% saying yes. Do you think that people that leave their religion leave Islam? Obviously, if you leave Christianity and come to Islam, you're great. But if you leave Islam to go anywhere else, should you be killed? Again, the responses are in the high 80s and 90s saying yes. And depending on the country, but this Pew Research went across many, many Muslim majority countries. I don't know exactly how many, but there are like over 60 close to 60 Muslim majority countries. And in some countries it's much, much higher. And in some countries it's, you know, closer to 60% or something, but it's still very troubling. There's no denying that conservative Muslims are the vast majority. It's it's like you were describing this, you don't think about it, it's just the way it is. That's me here living in the West where I was in a bubble. So I'm here in Canada and I live in my own separate bubble, but the world around me is completely different. So I'm sure it was the same for Jehovah's Witnesses as well, and Mormons and, Hasidic Jews, et cetera, et cetera. So you're kind of here, but you're not. So just imagine in a country like Egypt or, Iraq or Pakistan, Afghanistan, et cetera, Saudi Arabia, where everybody around you is singing the same chorus. And I mean, in Egypt, there's what, 10% Christian population? And that's it. There are no Jews. I'm sure there are atheists in there, but they're not like research is going to show us who they are because these people are too afraid to even tick that on a box in a survey, right? So, and even those 10% in Egypt are constantly being killed. The Coptic Christians are being murdered in their place of worship all the time because they will not even be okay with a 10% population being something else other than Muslims. And that's because the brainwashing works so much better when everybody is on the same page. If you have dissenting opinions and you have dissenting different narratives, then it's harder to keep everybody on track. So this is why the very vast majority of Muslims are conservative, because most of them live in Muslim majority countries.
I'm glad you've unequivocally dealt with that, because again, I'm preempting. I know what's going to happen in the comments section, and I think it's important to kind of address the elephant in the room and recognize that your experience is definitely common. And sure, there will always be exceptions. There will be Jehovah's Witnesses who would never dream of shunning their family member, for example, but they are very much in the minority. So
that's true. Yeah. And it's also important to make the distinction between the people and the religion. So this is what I'm talking about is what the doctrine teaches. My family followed the doctrine as closely as possible. Other people may not, because there are over 1 billion Muslims. So obviously different people are going to adhere to their religion to different degrees. But when we talk about the religion itself, which is what I generally do, unless I'm talking about my own personal experience, I'm talking about the religion itself. And the religion itself demands all of these things. It demands that you kill non-Muslims. It demands that you do not even befriend non-Muslims, right? It demands that that you're not allowed to be gay, basically, or that gay people should be killed. This is Sharia. This is what all of these Muslim majority countries that I just mentioned, they have Sharia in their laws. Some of them, again, to different extents, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, 100% Sharia, but in other countries, just aspects of Sharia. But it's still very, very dangerous.
Indeed, not to be taken lightly at all. I guess another element of your story that I just do need to revisit, I'm wondering if you can kind of explain roughly what the process was for waking up from your indoctrination. Was there something that kind of made you stop and think, maybe this isn't the truth?
Yeah, so after I got away and my daughter and I got away and I started going to university because that was not something that my family was going to support. So I had to get away from my family as well. And started going to university, and I just took a history of religions course as an elective because I thought, hey, this will be an easy A. I'm very, very versed in 1/3 of the 3 Abrahamic religions. So hopefully I'll just be an elective, right? Like just something I'll do, like a fluff course. And I had no idea that course was going to change my life. People always talk about, oh, you had a bad experience in Islam, that's why you left Islam. No, all of these horrible things happened to me, and I was still a true believer. I remember the moment I left my mom's house, I remember thinking to myself, I have nobody in this world except for Allah. Like, no, I cannot rely on my mom. I cannot rely on my brother. I can't, that's it. I have to just rely on Allah. It's just me and my daughter, and He's going to look out for us. So all of these things happened, and I was still a true believer. It wasn't until I took that course and started learning about how this Quran, which I was taught was the literal word of God. And then that's when I realized that it's actually plagiarized. And it was shockingly plagiarized. Like, it wasn't even good plagiarism. It was like really badly done. And all of a sudden, there's quite a few things in the Quran that just don't make any sense. And we were always told, like, oh, our brains are just not, we're just not intelligent enough to comprehend it, right? This is way above our abilities. And then it turns out, because it was just like a bad copy paste job, basically, quite a few things were taken from stories from the Torah or from the Bible, and they weren't fully in there. Just pieces of them were in there. And there's even some Hebrew text in there accidentally. Like, there's all sorts of weird things going on. And then all the pieces started to come together, but just realizing that it wasn't the literal word of God, that it had actually been said before, like all the way back to pagan stories, even before the Abrahamic religion started. That's when I was like, hang on a minute. And that was the thread that started to help the sweater unravel. And I was very, very happy to not believe, because I was so scared of not believing. I did all of these horrible things, and I followed along with all of these horrible things because I was so terrified of what would happen to me if I didn't. And so the thought of the fact that this wasn't real, and that I don't actually have to do these things, and I don't have to be this way, was, I mean, is the most wonderful news I could have gotten, right? It was so liberating, but it wasn't that quick. It wasn't like I could just pull off a Band-Aid. The brainwashing was still there, very, very deep into my brain. And so it took me a very long time to come to grips with it and to accept it and to finally call myself an atheist. And even then, I still have remnant things in my mind.
That was actually going to be one of my questions. Do you have fears, doubts, or flashbacks as a result of your years as a Muslim? Because that's something that happens with former witnesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've also come to accept, because for years and years and years, I thought one day I'll be free. And I finally accepted that I won't be, and that's okay. Like, it's too late, really. I'll never be able to know where Yasmine begins and where Islam ends. Like, I cannot separate those two anymore. It was too much a part of who I was growing up. And so a lot of things that I think are like just the way I am, or just the way I feel, I don't know if that's true or if it's because of the indoctrination. So I'm okay with the fact that I can't ever cleanse this from myself, because I have 2 daughters, and I stopped the cycle. So they will never know this world. They will have no comprehension of what we're talking about right now. And so that's okay with me. If I have to carry this shit with me till I die, I'm fine with it, as long as it doesn't get passed on past me.
Yeah, it's like that with me and my daughter as well. She has a completely blank canvas now. And it's actually funny because we live in the same building as her grandparents who are Jehovah's Witnesses. And without us even trying, Jessica is obsessed with Christmas. She's just been obsessed with Halloween. We haven't tried to point her in that direction. She just naturally gravitates towards Christmas. And of course, that's one thing witnesses can't stand. So it's been interesting seeing the reaction of her grandparents when she's been asking where her presents are and where Santa is and that kind of thing.
Well, that's good that her grandparents are still a part of your life and her life, though.
Yeah, it's not like that for many in our situation, but we have quite a unique predicament, and we've managed to kind of forge a unique kind of situation for ourselves, shall we say. I'm wondering if you can give us some kind of flavour of the ex-Muslim community and what it looks like. Is it one harmonious convergence of like-minded free thinkers, or is there friction and infighting?
Well, people are people. Whether people are Muslims or atheists or Christians or whatever, there's going to be, you know, every individual is an individual. So just like we can't say all Muslims X, we can't say all Muslims ex-Muslims, you know, X, Y, or Z either. Muhammad Syed, who is one of the co-founders of Ex-Muslims of North America, has a really great quote where he said, "The only thing all ex-Muslims have in common is something that we used to have in common." So it's kind of an unrealistic goal that we would expect that we're all going to get along and be one big happy family. But the thing is, as Muslims, we were part of an ummah, which is like part of this community, part of this group that's bigger than anything else. So a complete stranger who is a Muslim, you value that person, you know, way above your best friend or even your family member who is a non-Muslim. So like way above, like they're not even in the same playing field. So when ex-Muslims leave this very tight-knit community, we naturally look for another tight-knit community because you miss that. And for me, I was on my own for like 15 years. So I got over the fact that I wasn't going to be part of any communities. But when I started finding other ex-Muslims, I was excited for a bit, like, ooh, yay, you know, my brethren, my people. But, you know, it's reality hits pretty quickly that we're all just individuals and we're all just people and we all come from our different experiences and our different backgrounds and different political affiliations, and we all we're not all going to think, we're not going to all have the same group think that we had as Muslims, because that's the whole reason why we left.
Indeed. No, you have to kind of reach that realization by yourself. It's just I'm smiling because you could be describing life as an ex-Jehovah's Witness right there. You really could. I actually think that when you see friction and disagreement and controversy and infighting, to a degree, it's something to kind of be pleased about in a strange way, because it shows that the movement's growing and it shows that you have more diverse people joining with different ideas and bringing different perspectives to the table. Because I can remember when I first woke up as from the JWs, it was definitely a smaller movement, we'll put it that way, and there was a far more evangelical slant to being an ex-JW. It was kind of taken as a given that you would still believe in God and that kind of thing. And it just seems that since then, there has been more friction, but in a way, as unpleasant as it can be and as ugly as it can be, it's a reminder that, like you say, we're all different, we all have different ideas, and not everyone's going to get on with each other. So.
And that's a good thing, you know, like you said, it is something to be celebrated, because as Muslims, we all thought and believed the exact same way. It was really, really boring. Nobody had any, if anybody did have a dissenting opinion or question or thought, they kept it to themselves. So we were all just like a bunch of cyborgs regurgitating the same sort of thing. And so I'm happy with us all being able to say what we want to say, even if I disagree with it.
Indeed. Now, obviously, a lot of my viewers will be very familiar with the threat posed by Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. How would you, though, summarize the more problematic elements of the faith that aren't necessarily related to the jihadist mentality?
Women and gay people, really, they're the ones that suffer the most under Islam. I mean, it's a religion made by men for men. So as a straight man, you are the least oppressed under Islam, but that by no means that you're happy and free. But it's not nearly as insidious as it is for women, and as it is for anybody who is different from the majority. So I say gay people, but really anybody who is a little bit different from the expectation of what a Muslim person should look like. So, although, I mean, this is kind of a horrible thing to say, but just hear me out for a second. So it's kind of like the way people in North Korea are suffering right now, and we're just going about our lives, and we're like, yeah, that really sucks. Oh, you guys think the bugs talk and tell the emperor on you guys? Oh, that's too bad. Or not the emperor, he's the leader or whatever. But then we just like go about our day. But if North Koreans were ramming trucks into innocent people every day, then we would be paying more attention to the people that are being oppressed in North Korea. We would start to pay attention to what's going on over there. Why are there so many murderers coming out of that area of the world? So that's kind of what it's like, the way it's been for Muslims for all of these years. We've all been suffering silently over there because a lot of those countries, if you open your mouth, you will be killed. If you're lucky, you will be imprisoned. But most of the time you're killed. And if you're not killed by the state, you're killed by your peers. You're killed by the people if they find out that you are in any way dissenting from the accepted narrative. So there was nobody paying attention, and there was nobody that we could speak to. There was nobody that cared. That was it. We just lived like that. And now that it grew and grew, and it got stronger and stronger, and now the shit that we have been dealing with in the Muslim world is spilling out into the Western world. Now people in the West are starting to pay attention to what's happening over there. So people in the Muslim world, quite a few people in the Muslim world, were feeling like grateful that at least the conversation was, grateful isn't the right word, because of course people were dying in order for this to happen.
No, I do know what you mean.
I'm trying to, yeah.
But you don't like the idea of people dying, and you don't like the idea of misery being exported. But the one positive that you can take from it, because that you have to kind of analyze it in that way, is that you want to see oppressive regimes and an oppressive religion given more scrutiny, is what you're saying.
That's right. And that almost happened. But then what ended up happening was the opposite, unfortunately. A lot of people in the West, instead of speaking up the way we expected them to, and supporting the liberal Muslims or ex-Muslims or reformers the way we expect them to, because we all share the same values, they ended up turning against us and being supportive of the oppressive regimes. And so it was kind of like this moment of like, it just went exactly in the opposite direction. So there's a really sharp betrayal that a lot of people in the Muslim world are feeling right now. And there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger towards the West now. And they have been fighting this fight for a very long time. So when we talk about Muslim Brotherhood, for example, they're deemed a terrorist organization in most Muslim majority countries. But then I'm in Canada, but in the United States, they're questioning, like, should we deem them a terrorist organization? Are the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization? Like, for somebody from Egypt to even ask that question is like, are you fucking high? Like, are you serious? Do you have any clue what these people have been doing for the past 100 years? So there's such ignorance, unfortunately, about this whole situation, which I really don't think is that complicated. But the problem is that people are speaking to the wrong people. Instead of speaking to liberal Muslims, open-minded people from the Muslim world, they speak to the Muslim Brotherhood and they ask them, what's the best thing that we could do to help people in Syria or in Egypt or whatever? So they're getting, of course, the wrong answers. And just today, the Barbie that came out with the hijab on, and she's being celebrated, and there's celebrities talking about how great this is and how cool it is. Or when Alicia Keys was tweeting a picture of a woman in niqab and talking about how gorgeous it is. Like that kind of, I don't think it's that difficult to understand. I don't think, I don't really give them any excuse for that kind of ignorance. I don't give them any leeway. I feel like if you took any girl and you covered her from head to toe in black, nobody would call that beautiful. So why is it when you take a Muslim girl and you cover her head to toe in black, all of a sudden that's beautiful? Why? Why are they treated as different human beings than anybody else? Why aren't they afforded the same respect as everybody else? Do you think that they're different? Because they're not different. In the same way that it would be offensive to you and it would be misogynistic, modesty culture, et cetera, it's exactly the same for all human beings.
On the one hand, you can kind of look at how the left are dealing with it and think, well, they must be well-meaning deep down. They must be kind of wanting to do and say the right thing. But on the other hand, especially from how you're describing it, there's a tremendous arrogance to it as well, isn't there? Because they're happy to see Muslim women subjugated, so long as it's not them that's subjugated. They're comfortable with it being the other person, but not they themselves.
Yes. Over here, we're talking about hashtag free the nipple, but then we also have hashtag hijab day, where we put hijabs on and we celebrate that. What? Why? Are we not all human? If you prick us, do we not all bleed? Like it just, why is there a different set of rules for these people as opposed to these people? The values system that you have should apply to all human beings. So yeah, you're right. It is arrogance, and it's also bigotry because it's treating people differently based on their nationalities, based on their ethnicities.
What would you say to those who insist on using words like Islamophobia, or who believe that criticism of Islam should be muted?
Well, criticism of Islam should not be muted. Criticism of no ideologies should ever be muted. And that's why we have such a problem with the term Islamophobia. If you're going to talk about anti-Muslim bigotry or, just bigotry in general, of course we're going to support that. No human being should ever be treated differently than anybody else. Nobody should have to deal with discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. However, when we're talking about an ideology, I can sit here and I can say everything I want about communism or about Republicans or the Republican Party or Nazis or the Nazism. And then all of that is completely acceptable. But if I start to talk about Islam, all of a sudden that's Islamophobic. Well, no, that's unacceptable to me. Every ideology should be open to criticism and even ridicule. And like I said, like we just talked about earlier, I'm happy with everybody being able to speak, even if I disagree with what they're saying. Muslims do not agree with me. As a Muslim, that's not the way I was raised. And Muslims are the exact opposite. So over here, we talk about we have to respect people, not ideologies. In the Muslim world, it's exactly the opposite. You do not have to respect people, but you better fucking respect this ideology. You say one word against Islam, and you can get yourself killed. But you can say everything you want about individual people.
It is astonishing how it's allowed. It's one area in which I can't kind of relate too much, because in my own work as an ex-Jehovah's Witness or an advocate for leaving Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't encounter all that much people saying, oh, well, you shouldn't criticize your form of faith. I do get people who are completely oblivious to Jehovah's Witnesses and assume it's some kind of benign group, and that you'd have to be really bitter and disaffected to find a reason to gripe against it. But I don't get people saying that you're not allowed to criticize your form of religion. So for you to encounter that at the level that you're encountering it on a daily basis, I can imagine it being extremely frustrating.
Yeah, and it is extremely frustrating, and it goes back to my point again of not treating us all equally. And speaking of Jehovah's Witnesses, I got to tell you something really funny, because you know how everybody always makes fun of how Jehovah's Witnesses come, knock on your door, interrupt your day, and want to talk to you about this, that, or the other thing. And everybody, their jokes are all over the place, all the time, talking about how annoying that is. That's the number one thing anybody ever says about Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, Muslims started to do that. They started to take their Qurans, take some pamphlets, and go door to door. And guess what? People were tweeting about how wonderful that was. Isn't this great?
Oh dear.
So,
They've really started using
about,
that strategy, have they?
They've started using that strategy, and it's a wonderful thing to see. So there you go again with the bigotry of treating one group of people differently than another. Why is it that when it's a white person coming to your door, it's annoying, but when it's a brown person coming to your door, all of a sudden it's a fantastic thing that we completely applaud?
It is bigotry, isn't it? It's trying so hard to be not bigoted that you end up being bigoted in a strange way. So what hope, if any, is there for reforming Islam?
You know, I am an optimist. So I honestly do not, knowing the Muslims that I know, having grown up in a conservative Muslim household, I can never see this succeeding. We are raised differently than, especially Sunni Muslims. There's no questioning. You just accept it the way you're taught. So the thing with the reformers is they're coming along and they're saying, nah, ignore what Allah said. Ignore what Muhammad said. Listen to me, random dude. You know, and I'm not an imam. I don't have any, credentials. I can't technically save you from going to hell if I'm wrong, but you still need to listen to me anyway. And that's never going to fly. I mean, they have the book in front of them in black and white, and they know that if they don't follow, or they feel that if they don't follow what's written in this book, they're going to burn in hell. So some average human being coming and telling them, let's do it this way instead, isn't really going to cut through that. That's my first sort of feeling that this is not, it's not worth, I wouldn't ever stand up against reform, but it would never be what I would put my energy into. I would put my energy into speaking the truth and honesty and answering questions with evidence. I wouldn't put my energy into something that's like a blend. You know what I mean? It's like if I meet somebody who's a flat earther, I'm not going to sit there and start to talk to them about, how about if we just reform that? What about if you be a quasi flat earther? What if you just like agree that it's
a
like,
bumpy earther.
A little, yeah, that's right. I wouldn't do that. I would go straight to the evidence and I would tell them what the evidence shows us to be the truth. So I would treat all, any incorrect ideas in the same way. If somebody comes and asks me, I'll tell them what I know to be true. And that's what it comes down to. I support reformers as individuals, so individual reformers, not as a group, because again, they're all completely different people. But if somebody, I don't care who that person is, whether they identify as a Muslim or a Jewish or a Zoroastrian or a Hindu, I don't care. As long as we agree on the same values at the end of the day, if they also believe in universal human rights, if they also believe in, liberal values and secularism and, women's rights, LGBT rights, et cetera, then we can work together, of course, because we have the same goal. We may not have the same way of reaching those goals, but we believe in the same things at the end of the day. So I'm happy to work with reformers that are working towards these same positive goals as I am.
So what does a dream scenario look like to you? I mean, you've already said that you can't see Islam changing. Do you foresee a time where so many Muslims wake up, including in majority Muslim countries, that Islam becomes an irrelevance?
The only way that could ever happen is if there's a separation of mosque and state, which is what helped Christianity reform and become the religion that it is today, which is more about faith as opposed to all of the other horrible stuff. So right now, Islam is just too politically powerful. You've got the OIC, which are the second largest intergovernment group on the planet after the UN, and then they're all made up of Muslim majority countries. You've got Saudi Arabia, which is like, I mean, need I say more? So we have, unless we can topple these Islamic theocracies, the people will never be free to even think that there might be a different way to see the planet. There is no option. I mean, when I didn't even know that you could not be a Muslim. It's like being black and saying I'm not black anymore. I really did believe that it was part of who I was. So a lot of Muslims will tell you the exact same thing. They thought they were the only ex-Muslim in the world. So the idea that there may not be a God, or the idea that all the stuff that we were taught there is like the smallest possibility that it's not 100% truth, that's never an option. And that's me in Canada. So imagine when you're in a country where the education system and the entire society is all pushing you in that same direction. You end up becoming like salmon in a river. You're just flowing with everything. You don't think about it.
I think bottom line, if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, and applying my own kind of experiences with Jehovah's Witnesses, it feels as though there's a long, long way to go, and such an enormously long way to go that it's very unrealistic that we'll see demonstrable change in our lifetime. Because when I look at the situation with Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, well, it would be nice if at least the government could recognise the fact that they shouldn't be rewarding Jehovah's Witnesses by giving them tax exemptions and giving them charitable status. I'm sorry, you don't get to break up families and call yourself a charity. But rather than taking steps to limit that, in a way the government's actually supporting it by giving them charitable status. That's how far behind we are. So there's so far to go with Jehovah's Witnesses, and from what you're telling me, it may not be our grandchildren that will see an earth that isn't threatened by fundamentalist Islamic violence.
I mean, I don't want to say that because I don't want to believe that. But I think you're right. I do. I mean, with Leah Remini doing this show about Scientology now, I mean, it's very rare that you will hear me say something positive about Trump. So, but
he said that he would be happy with Scientology disappearing or something, didn't he?
Or losing its tax exempt status. Yeah. Which, I mean, if he does that, if he really does follow through with that, that's the end of Scientology, because it's a big money making corporation right now. So if they lose that, then they won't be able to continue. And I think in the same way that would be like the dagger in the heart of Scientology, I think separating mosque and state in Islamic countries will do the same sort of thing, because it will just free people to... Secularism will free people, because then it will just give them choices. Whereas now they just don't have choices.
Indeed. Well, it's a sobering view, but it's a pragmatic view. When you break free of religion, you're no longer interested in hearing what you want to hear. You're interested in hearing, well, what are the facts? What do I have to get to come to terms with? What would be your advice to someone who is friends with a Muslim and wonders whether there is anything they can say or do to help them out of their indoctrination?
I wouldn't recommend trying to help them out of their indoctrination, because that person will get defensive and it could end up ruining the friendship. But I would recommend instead is just talking to them the same way you would talk to anybody else. So not choosing your words so as to not offend, and just being as honest with them as you would be with anybody else. So when they tell you that they have ridiculous beliefs, if they're going to try and support those ridiculous beliefs to you, then respond to them in the same way you would respond to somebody who was telling you they're an anti-vaxxer or flat earther or any other ridiculous belief. So that I think that is, if you just treat Muslims like normal human beings, then I think that would go a very, very long way.
Indeed. There's kind of a reason as well I'm asking you that, because in the former Jehovah's Witness community, there's a rather ugly trend of kind of confronting Jehovah's Witnesses and storming into their kingdom halls and raising a scene. And I've kind of long advocated that kind of behaviour can only be counterproductive, because it basically confirms the persecution narrative that they've been fed by their leaders.
Exactly. Yeah, totally agree.
So I'm glad that you would advocate similar for Muslims. And frankly, I mean, I live near Bosnia. And there's obviously a number of Muslims in Bosnia, but in my day-to-day life I don't encounter Muslims that often, because Croatia's a majority Catholic country. But whenever I'm in the UK, I obviously see a lot of Muslims, and it's quite an interesting experience for me, because I've obviously been away from the UK while I've been waking up. And so I go back, and whether I'm seeing a monk walking down the street, or a nun, or a Muslim, or any kind of obviously religious denomination, I'm thinking, I'm sorry, you're wrong. and there's this urge to, I wish I could explain to you, but like you say, sometimes it's best to just be nice, and just to show them that non-believers can be good people too.
Mm-hmm. I'm really happy to hear that you get the same reaction regardless of what kind of an individual or what kind of religious clothing this individual is wearing, because I've had quite a few people say to me, like, well, if I see somebody, in a bonnet and a long dress, or if I see somebody, with a fur hat and little twirlies or whatever, like I know right away that they're conservative of whatever religion. But if I see somebody in a hijab, that's not necessarily true. Again, why?
It's all delusional, so it doesn't really matter.
It's all delusional. Why is Islam always given this exceptionality? Like, no, it's the exact same thing. If you are so religious that your clothing indicates what tribe you're from, then that means you're a conservative member of that group.
Indeed. So, because obviously I go into Zagreb and you see a lot of monks wandering around Zagreb, and I have the exact same feeling when I see them. If there are any Muslims watching this interview, what would your message be?
My message to the Muslims would be, if you are, I would ask you to do two things. First of all, if you are not an Arabic speaking person, because most Muslims are not, right? Only, I think, around 15% of Muslims are actually Arabic speaking. And even of those 15%, very few of them actually read the Quran, actually read the Ahadith, actually learned about the life of their prophet. So a huge percentage of Muslims are following this religion without knowing what they're following, right? It's like the whole, do you agree to these terms and conditions? Click yes. Actually, they never even had a chance to click yes because they were born into it. So I ask these Muslims to take a look at this ideology that you are choosing as your identity, because right now you're an adult and you can't say, oh, I was born into it. That doesn't work anymore because you're not a child. So now you're a grown up. Take a look at what you are identifying yourself as. And if you feel comfortable with all of the things that are in this religion and you want to stay in it, that's fine. That's your prerogative. But just make sure that you're making an informed decision, that you're not just a part of this because you were born into it and it's because everybody in your community and your family and your society, et cetera, are a part of it. But just look into it, learn about it, and decide if this is actually who you want to identify as.
Very mature, reasonable advice, I think. I hope it will be helpful to one or two viewers. And there's a final question, Yasmine, that I need to ask you. Do you have anything to plug?
Oh, yeah. If you have any listeners that are in Australia or New Zealand, I will be traveling there with Majid Nawaz, who is a Muslim reformer from the UK. and with Ali Rizvi, who is the author of a book called The Atheist Muslim and my co-host on the Secular Jihadist podcast. So the three of us will be traveling all around Australia and New Zealand to talk about a movie that is a documentary based on a book called Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which is written by Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz.
I have it, yeah.
Oh, good.
It's good,
yeah. So this documentary is based on that book, and Majid and Niley and I will be going around Australia and New Zealand to talk about it. And if your listeners are in Australia and New Zealand, I hope they'll get tickets to come and see us. We're going to be in multiple cities in both countries. And also my book, hopefully, will be coming out just in time for Christmas. So like you mentioned, my book is called From Al-Qaeda to Atheism, and I'll post on my Twitter and Facebook and everywhere as soon as it's available. And please listen to our podcast, the Secular Jihadist podcast, which is a weekly podcast with 4 ex-Muslims. And we're all from different backgrounds. All the 3 guys are from Shia background, but I'm from Sunni background. And so we have all these different opinions and different ideas, and we have fun.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, if I were in Australia, I'd be fascinated to go to that event or one of those events. And I know I have viewers from Australia, so if you're watching from Australia, please go along and support if you can. But that sounds like a fascinating project. I wish you all the best with it. I'm looking forward to getting your book when it's out. It sounds from just the story that you've recounted like it's going to be a film one day. So I want to read it before it gets turned into a film.
You'll get a signed copy, Lloyd.
Oh, I really hope so. That would be an honour. So Yasmine, it's been fantastic having you on the channel. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.
So viewers, I hope you found that as enjoyable and enlightening as I have. Please don't forget to subscribe for similar interviews, and as always, thank you for watching.